Yeah.
Good morning and welcome to Masters of Marketing. Today we're going to be talking with the owner of Come Alive Creative, which is an agency that specializes in full service podcast production for businesses and organizations. And he's going to teach us how to reuse our content to address more of our audience. Let's give a warm welcome to Jeff Large. Jeff, great to have you today.
Hello, gents. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Just for everyone in the audience, I want to remind you that this is an Ask Me Anything. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to throw them into Zoom or throw them into the chat on Facebook Live. We'll shout them out. And the structure of this is just going to be a quick 10-minute presentation and then 20 minutes of question and answer where we'll get into all sorts of witty, off-the-cuff content, conversation, etc. So Jeff, with that, I'll let you get started. Can't wait to hear what you have to say.
All right, awesome. Here we go. I'm going to kick on a slide. Can we see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So recycling your content. This is really a distilled version of a talk that I've given in a couple different forms. So we're going to kind of keep it streamlined and slick. This whole idea started with me with the lumber industry, and I have no idea how I stumbled upon this article, but it was just around like the 50s or so, maybe 40s, 50s, 60s, I forget which decade. The lumber industry was struggling, and they had to do massive things in order to get profits up, in order to compete. And so instead of just using sort of the best parts of the wood for paper and things like that, things that we typically think of, they had to start getting creative in terms of like reusing the little chunks that fall off when they're cutting it, or the bark into mulch, or even selling the sawdust. Like, it got as desperate as they started selling the sawdust. And it made me think, okay, how in the world can I apply some of these principles to my own business? And so the premise that I'm going to begin with is that if you are creating content for a single purpose, you're cheating yourself and your audience. And so that's what we kind of want to keep in mind as we move forward. So take a moment, and unfortunately, I like both of you gentlemen, Brian and Ross, but I don't know who's out there right now. So whatever you do, I'm assuming we come from different industries, different backgrounds. If you want to throw that out in the chat, that'd be cool to know kind of what vertical or what industry or niche you're working in. But my guess is that we all like to learn differently. Before I started my agency, I was a teacher. And so when I reflect on this question of how we learn, these are just a few. I know for myself, it's things like blogs and articles, podcasts, social media, newsletters, videos, books, presentations, visuals, audiobooks, you name it. There's all different kinds of ways that we are consuming information. And so with that, I'm going to argue that if you aren't creating content in at least 3 different ways, so whatever content you make, it needs to be used at least 3 different ways, and almost that same content verbatim. And let me kind of break it down or give you an example how. So when I first started my journey very early, it's probably like, I don't even know now, 6 years ago, 8 years ago or something. I'm running the podcast company now, like I mentioned. And they, when I originally started, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And so I had a friend of mine, he's like, well, let's try running some AdWords. We're going to do some AdWords against maybe a course on podcasting or something, because it was something I knew really, really well. So I spent the time, I wrote up this like 4,000 word post on everything on how to start your podcast from beginning to end, tested it against his knowledge and stuff. And just based on the results, he's like, I don't think this idea is going to work. And at that point, that article on how to start a podcast that was that long could have just died. It could have been the one use of it. But what I ended up doing is I got partnered up with a company, OS Trainings, and they offer different kinds of trainings. And I ended up selling that 4,000 word post, and we broke it down into smaller articles, and I sold them the rights to put it on their site in terms of teaching people how to podcast. It ended up doing really well, and then it became a video series on top of that. The other thing that I made sure that I did was I got the rights I retained rights. Like, I made sure that I could use it still. And so I also tweaked those articles just slightly so they were different, put them on my own website. One of those articles in particular was about equipment. And I got asked so often, what equipment do you need? I turned that into a website, and then that website became a newsletter. I also repurposed it over on, there's a website called Kit. It's really popular for creators. If you're like into video or audio equipment, those types of things, you can kind of show off the different kinds of equipment that you use. And so I put up a bunch of the equipment that I was recommending in these 2 things onto my Kit. I also was able to talk about it on a podcast that I had about podcasting, so very meta, but we had different episodes about each pieces of equipment and why you wanted to use it. And so essentially I was just reusing the equipment or reusing the content that I had here on the podcast. And then finally, I've spoken on it. I've had several different speaking gigs where I've talked about how do you build a podcast and was able to pull directly from those original sources that I made. And so when I step back and I look at it holistically, it started with this big long article and it could have died right here. But instead, we were able to repurpose it into smaller blog posts, sell it to OS trainings. They use the written portion. We turned that written portion into a video portion. And then choosing my own adventure down this way, was able to put it on my own website, broke it out into separate websites, turned it into a newsletter, turned it into podcast episodes, and turned it into presentations. And so everybody wins. We're all happy. We're all excited. It's great. Now, I understand this is just one example from a guy for talking less than 10 minutes, and you might be skeptical. But the reality is that I'm not the first person. I didn't come up with this stuff. I just happened to figure it out. Other people are doing it that we know. Take a loudmouth person like Gary Vee. The vast majority of his content is this. The guy answered a bunch of questions on YouTube, turned it into like 14 million other different kinds of content, made a book on it, all this stuff. So he's repurposing like crazy. Take another big wig like Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss, like that book, Tools of Titans, is just this massive like encyclopedia of all the conversations that he's had. And he turned it into another best-selling book. And so people are doing this all the time. Like this is not anything new and it's nothing special directly to me. But the question then I leave you with is how are you going to start repurposing your best content? Like that's the easiest place to go. Take a look at your Google Analytics, take a look at your podcast database, whatever it is. Look at some of your most popular stuff and then think about what is at least one new way that you can reuse that. And then so I don't know if you guys want this now, but my little close is my company, Come Live Creative, for me personally or my podcast, my website. Boom, I'm done.
Damn, that's
Drop
awesome.
the mic,
All right.
except it's on a stand.
Okay, so you do podcasts for other companies, right?
Yeah, we work mostly, we do the best with companies. So it's like B2B type stuff. We're usually working with mid to large size organizations. We occasionally will get high profile individuals like authors or speakers.
Yeah.
But the way that we're structured, we usually cater better to the like marketing teams opposed to DIY individuals or things like that.
Yeah. This question is coming to come from a place of a challenging place, and this is probably our third kind of go around of trying to kick off like a show or an interview type of show before, and COVID's been just like the perfect time for it. And I'm in a lot of different communities because we tried a YouTube channel before. I guess the question is, and the common trope that they talk about in terms of that the challenge to kind of like your strategy that I'd place out there is that a lot of the people and YouTubers especially kind of have this idea where I shouldn't be working on distribution. I should be working on my craft. I should be working on my content more than I should think about how to slice and dice all this content up and distribute it. Is there any kind of formulation or calculation that you have, and when you would see it was appropriate to really concentrate on the cutting up and distribution versus, oh, I should just actually work on my craft and work on my content more and get it to a quality place? Because if you're kind of like garbage in and garbage out, it doesn't matter how you cut it up and distribute it, right? It's like, where do you feel like that threshold is before the strategy comes into play?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I default back to two things. You have to live in the tension. Like you named two different opposites of, do we spend our time creating or do we spend our time distributing? And you might get arguments for either. I'm in the podcast world. I'm not a professional YouTuber by any means. But in the podcast world, there's a lot of people where it's just like, just focus on the show, make it the best ever, and that'll draw people in. And then other people, I'll watch like the conversations in Facebook groups and they're like, should I use paid ads? And like stuff like this. It reminds me of a C.S. Lewis quote where we were talking about faith versus works. So if we kind of bring faith into this for a second, and he's like, basically, I'm going to paraphrase that. He says it's like a pair of scissors. It's sort of stupid to think that only one blade will cut. Like you need both in order to do the work. And so specifically, like, do I have a ratio or something? Honestly, no. It kind of depends on, for me, it'd be variables like, what is your time? What's your personal resources, like your personal bandwidth? Are you in a place that you're able to hire people or get help in that regard? But to think that you could only do one or another, that would be what I'd argue is a mistake. Like, you have to find some sort of balance. For me, I have the unfair advantage of a team. When I think about when I'm doing these things on my own, I kind of have that gut feeling of like, I don't know. I guess I would use, like, I don't have a hard and fast answer, like plateau points maybe. Like, if you see your content sort of like, you'll go through growth spurts, but if you plateau out, okay, maybe reevaluate them. But there's different things you can do. I don't have a hard answer for that one, but hopefully finding the balance for yourself works.
All right, so you got a favorite piece of content. I saw on one of your slides, you cut it up into articles, you cut it up into tweets. Is there any particular channels that you find are the best for podcasts? Because I've also gotten some feedback on this as well, but I wanted to hear before I kind of plug some ideas as well with this distribution strategy.
Yeah, I think it depends. It's not so much a podcast related thing as much as it is an audience related thing. Any person that approaches us, I'm going to ask first, what is your goal and who is your audience? And based on those two things, I mean, that's such a crutch for everything else that happens. Like, based on your goal and based on your audience, you might want to, there's different kinds of shows. There's different kinds of, like, there's a lot of variables. There's the types of shows, there's the types of goals, and there's the types of help you can get. And so when it comes to stuff later down the chain, when we're talking about this distribution stuff, if you start doing all sorts of things on Twitter, but your target audience isn't on Twitter, you're going to be wasting a lot of time. If you are saying with any of them, I mean, if it's social, there's a lot of ways you can do this. Like, there's a lot of ways that you can reach out to people. I think the easiest thing is on our website, Come Alive Creative. I have a article, like a pretty robust article on promotion, and we go through 8 different techniques, and it's anything from some of the planning up front of like, what does your branding look like, to social media streams, to cross promotion with other podcasts, to repurposing, getting it up on YouTube or wherever it is. So there's a lot of different things you can do. But again, all of those things are contingent on who you're talking to and what you're trying to accomplish with your show. You might need huge numbers and you're going to have different strategy for that, versus if you need to reach the right people, you might have smaller numbers and it's going to be a different kind of strategy, and you'd have to approach each one unique.
Can you give an example of a specific business strategy that you might come across most often?
Explain that a little further. What do you mean by business strategy?
Like, maybe this business wants to connect with all of the people in engineering and they want to get clients, or this business just wants all the VPs of a certain company and they're doing account-based marketing. Like, what is the most common use case that you see someone who's creating a show is trying to solve with their business? And also, are there any things that you see someone create a show for the wrong reason? And what are those wrong reasons?
Okay, let me start with the wrong reason, because we actually had this come up the other day. We had a prospect, and then just so we're on the same language, I use hopefully the same terminology as predictable revenue. I forgot the name of the book for a quick second, but a prospect is somebody who's interested but didn't buy, and the client is somebody who's actually working with you. So we had a prospect come up with us, and he had the goal of really wide distribution. They wanted awareness. They wanted kind of a viral nature. He was hoping for 50,000 downloads an episode, was sort of the way that he was describing it to me. And then when I asked him what kind of show he had in mind, he was talking, we're going to have it was a company on, that did financial advising. He's like, our people are going to give advice on financial tips. And I'm like, okay, that style of show would probably be a solo based show or maybe an interview based show. A straight interview-based show is not going to garnish 50,000 downloads, like, especially out of the gate. Like, the only reason you see these interview-based shows, like, people forget people like Joe Rogan started in 2005 and never quit. Like, they have this huge reason of why they're popular and all these things, and just some Joe Schmo company, I mean, even if they're an established company, given some stuff, unless it's like gangbusters, amazing advice, if you want huge listenership, you're going to need to start looking at other things, like maybe a story-based format, something that you'd hear on public radio, or things along those lines, like your serials or startups or some of those kinds of shows. And so that's kind of what we have to distill down, where maybe one popular one Could be some of the things that we've at least identified would be maybe thought leadership. It could be education. It could be, like we said, it could be like what we name the moneymaker, which is more of like if you want to make sponsorship revenue. And each one of those is different. So again, if you're looking at, say, you just need to become an authority in this space in engineering or whatever it is, start a show. It could be interview based. It could get a little more, you could get a little more dynamic in terms of how you're editing it and those types of things to make it more interesting. But as long as you're associating with the right people, with the other leaders in the industry, with the people that you want to work with, you don't need a huge following. You need the right following, and you need people that will actually take action when they show up. Whereas on the flip side, if you want big sponsorship revenue, you need numbers and you need a show that can appeal to all kinds of people. And so hopefully that answers your question, but there's definitely different approaches for the goals and the outcomes that you want.
That totally answers my question. The small segment become known, or the large become a large quantity, add revenue, very different. For this,
Yeah.
so you mentioned a lot of editing. What is, for the person just getting started, you think the best way to move forward with minimum editing, minimum team? Have you seen, like, interview style is one of the types where you don't have to do that much editing, but are there other types of shows that have, minimal editing so you can spend most of your time distributing?
Yeah, I laugh because the easiest thing is just pay somebody else to do it. But it depends on where you're at. Like, so for the people that we work with, like I said, it's usually like marketing teams and such who they know their strengths, they know their audience, but they totally get that we're not going to take on this entire behemoth of trying to figure out how to podcast. And then on the flip side, I don't want to underestimate either. Depending on what you're trying to do, you can start one for free. If you have a cell phone and download a specific app, you can grab different apps like an Anchor FM or something, you could start for free. It depends on things like, what is the production quality that you want? What are all these pieces? And so it is very dependent on those two levers of time and money of what it is that you want to do. And so it's too robust of a question for me to get into now, but it's anything from like you said, formats. If you just have sort of a gritty, off the cuff style, and you're just I know people that just record it straight through. They don't care if there's mistakes, and then they can publish it immediately. Obviously, that will go easier. If you have the money up front to invest in some equipment, there's equipment that, for example, like right now, you break it down into different sections like pre-production and post-production. So the things that happen before you record and the things that happen after. If you have a little bit of budget, you can get equipment that will help you sound better, that will help reduce noise in the background. You can treat the area that you're in. There's like basic techniques that you can use to make it sound better before you ever record. So hopefully that will help save you time later. And then again, once you start talking post-production, that can get a lot more technical. That can get a lot more difficult, and it's not always for everyone. And so there's different calibers of help you can get, and that's something you might want to look into.
It sounds like you've written an article about this, and this is the exact article on how you get
any
started.
of these questions I write, like, because again, repurpose your content. Like, I'm not going to answer the same questions 400 times. If I get it a couple times, I'm like, okay, we're doing something that I can point people to on this.
Gotcha. This is a question that I usually ask people when I've never met them before. What do you wish people would ask you about when they bring up this subject?
Oh, that's fun. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I think whatever people want to know, whatever I can be most helpful. And I don't know what you need to know. And so unfortunately, that's a fun question. And I think I might steal it because I do a ton of interviews, but I don't have a good answer for it because I would rather just like serve you guys and your audience.
Gotcha. Brian, I punt to you. Ask
Okay,
some
so
technical questions
I
or
talked
less.
to I talked to Christian Swain, and he had like the #1 music podcast for a while. And I was part of the San Francisco podcast organization, which is cool. If you're ever in San Francisco and you're there, the podcast meetup, there's like 20 some people, some really like high flying people. So Christian Swain came in, and he had like a top 5 music podcasts, right? And he was getting tons and tons of downloads. And he went in and he described his whole entire strategy. And he said he spent around $1 million for the previous 3 years on production and advertisement, and the way that he got a big giant pool was doing video trailers of his podcast on Twitter. Now he had a broad audience, right? So one of the things that he talked about there was depending upon the size of your audience is a topic. If you're talking about, jet skis and the fastest jet skis that are coming into the industry, your audience is not going to be 50 million people. You're maybe talking about like 1 million people. So his thing was like rock and roll archaeology. And so when you're kind of like approaching clients and they talk about kind of paid campaigns or distribution around that, do you kind of go through like a targeted methodology? Do you work with like finding like how do you get people that are directly associated for your clients? Is there a strategy you have around that in terms of paid, or is it organic, or what do you recommend?
It has to start at the beginning. I'm going to answer this in two ways.
Sure.
It's important to understand I don't do any a la carte work. So if you have an existing show and you came to us, like it would have to fit into a model that made sense. Like I mentioned, even just over this past quarter, we went through basically every proposal I've ever written, looked at all of the objectives, like because we're very goal driven in the way that we work. We looked at all of the objectives in terms of the goals and the KPIs. And it was from that we basically came up with our 6 archetypes or our 6 personas that we'll build for. So if it doesn't fit into one of those, we're not going to be a good fit for you. There's plenty of shows out there and there's plenty of help out there too. And so we're happy to recommend in that way. Normally what happens is that people will come to us at the beginning, like when they want one. And when they do that, we have 4 steps that we go through. One is the planning, it's the actual production, the promotion, and then tracking the progress. And so those are the four things that we have kind of deemed necessary for any successful product or any project. And with the planning and the production, I mean, that's you can kind of assume that there's going to be a strategy behind it. You have to identify those things up front. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the goals, the target audience, and what kind of show will help you achieve those things. And then that helps answer those questions later. It makes everything else later easier. And normally the way that it works is that the show with its planning and actually producing it is kind of self-contained in a single scope. There's a baseline of what we offer and what we recommend for the promotional aspects. And the way that we're structured too is that I'll usually pull in outside help if there's management needed. We'll provide the assets for you. And so those, like you said, I'm assuming he probably used something similar to like an audiogram is probably one of the more easier ways that they're referred to, or like you said, the video trailers, however you want to put it.
He was saying he was doing like 1 to 2 minute full on like movie style trailers for each one of his stories.
Okay, that's rad. That's super fun. And so I'm all about that. Again, assuming that it like fits with the caliber of the show. Like if you have a crappy show and you start doing like full on movie production trailers, it like maybe it'll make it better. I don't know.
In a world where podcasting takes over.
Exactly. And so like once that stuff comes up, like those assets will produce, but if it needs to be managed, like as soon as it moves over, like you said, into these like managed PPC campaigns, or like you want somebody to be using Hootsuite or Egger or whatever to manage your social, like we're going to probably work with your marketing team, or we'll bring in, because we have a lot of other agencies that we tap into for those types of things. And so I don't have as direct of an answer there, and it like so many of these things are just like we have our baseline, but outside of that it's kind of up to the client and their budget and what they want to do and what they need to accomplish.
Amazing. All right, I'll have one more question and then you can take over.
Okay.
So we've built a tool that takes a podcast and we convert it into an Alexa skill, so you can talk to it and essentially like talk to it. We transcribe everything and have a search engine on it so you can find the episode that answers your question, and nobody cared. What do you think about voice in terms of the future of podcasting? Do you think it's a thing? Do you think it's like way too early? Have you seen anything on the voice?
Voice is weird. It's funny that you bring this up. I went to Voice Summit last year, which was
we
outside of the norm. Oh,
we won the #1 media skill.
I feel like we've talked before then. We've probably touched, we'll have to like figure this out after the fact, but I was at Voice Summit and I met all kinds of people, and I was like just the podcast person. It was so weird because I'm so used to going to the suite, like small world. No, I went to a bunch of podcasting conference. I was like Podcast Movement and all the big ones there. But then I was like, okay, I'm going to see what's going on in voice. And voice is just like such a surreal place. It's definitely different. I feel like at that conference in particular, most of the companies were international and were not domestic. So that was really interesting. And it was just a different feel. I met several people who are doing, like you said, like briefings and the Alexa skills and stuff. And we had one, like I tested it out. I did about 200 something episodes on a podcast that we designed specifically to be in a skill or the Amazon briefing. And even while I was there, I was trying to hunt down people that worked for Amazon so I could pick their brains and just see like, where is this going? Like, what do I need to do in order to be successful? And basically nobody cared. Like nobody knew. And so I don't know, like, I don't want to just represent Amazon poorly, but I couldn't get any good information from anyone. That podcast, I'm probably going to discontinue because I'm not happy with the numbers. That being said, I know people who have made a business completely around helping people do this. I know people who have quote unquote successful briefings. I think there's stuff there. And I'm more interested in, especially now being home, like there's a lot of stuff that's even automatically happening without the need of additional tools. And that's why it's like almost a crapshoot. Like I feel kind of bad for you guys because they're moving so quickly. Like Google Home, all of a sudden it's like, okay, they're just available. And then Amazon's like, oh, well, they're available over here too. And so you could say like, oh, I want to listen. Hey, Alexa, I want to listen to the Jeff Large podcast. Okay. And then I'll pull up my most recent episode. Are people really listening that way? I don't know yet. And it's like, there's just so much room to just grow. Like the biggest takeaway from the voice conference, I guess the last thing I'll say was looking at it. It reminded me of early web when either A, people had no idea what they were talking about because they didn't figure it out yet, or B, they figured something out and they wouldn't share anything because they didn't want other people to steal it. Like that was probably my biggest takeaway from that conference.
It's so similar, man. It is. And the people that are in it, and there's barely anybody making money, and it's so like mine, like it's like my precious. I've figured it out, and I'm not telling anybody because if I tell anybody, you're taking some of my pie. It's not additive yet. So voice is really weird that way.
Yep.
Yeah.
We only have about 3 minutes left. One of the questions I love asking the most is, can you describe a situation where you worked on a project and it went completely not how you expected it, either in a good way or a bad way? You thought it was going to succeed and it totally failed, or you thought no one would care and it was the best thing ever?
Yeah. Do you want a board game example or a SAS example?
SAS.
All right. So I worked with a SaaS company. I asked because my first company we ever made was a board game publishing company. SaaS company I partnered with. It was one of our first clients, so several years ago. We wanted a podcast. The idea was to build authority, was the primary goal at that point. And so they were interviewing their customers who were using their products because they could see the analytics. They could see who was selling a ton because of their stuff. We had them on the show and they kind of flexed their expertise. They appreciated being on the show. So it built this like really great synergy. The thing that we found out on accident was that we learned so much information as a customer research tool. We're so used to going out and doing surveys and things like this, but because I co-hosted it with one of their customer care specialists or whatever the made up title was, we co-hosted together and we're able to ask questions. She was telling me all the time, her biggest takeaway is she's like, I get to hear these people's like wins and failures directly. We could see all that information in real time. And then based on the listenership, we didn't realize this at that point, and now we've kind of incorporated it into normally what we do, but we could see what people cared about. And so maybe an episode on Facebook ads was super high, and then maybe an episode on how to use Twitter properly was really low. Then they could inform their content they were creating from a blog angle, from their newsletter series and all of that stuff based on what we were finding within the podcast. And then again, you kind of get that snowball going or the dominoes moving or whatever dumb analogy you want to use. But that was some really helpful byproducts that we didn't realize before that point that now we use to kind of inform a lot of the work that we do.
That's an awesome takeaway. When we were first getting started interviewing people, we were doing it in the crypto space. And I honestly had no clue about anything crypto. And it was amazing that after interviewing 50 companies, everyone wanted to talk about themselves so much that you could use it to educate yourself about a space you had no idea about, because people are willing to explain things to you from the ground up for the sake of the audience. So that's an amazing takeaway. With just 1 minute left. Yeah. With just 1 minute left, my number one question is always, where do you go to learn more about staying ahead of the curve on what you're producing? I know you have a bookshelf behind you, but what's the newest content blogs coming out that you tap into to stay ahead?
Yeah, I think Okay. I do not mean this as self-promotion. My podcast, for what you just said, I'm a huge advocate about just learning in general. And I think similar to how I even started the talk with like a stupid lumber example, I think there's so much to learn cross industry.
Mm.
There's so much I pull from my teaching years. There's so much that I pull from being a huge board game fan. There's so much that I pull from other places that help inform me in what I'm doing. So I would just say, look around like to your interests and things and figure out where those parallels are. Coaching, I would put a big plug in for find a good mentor or a coach. It could be formal, it could be informal. You're all at a different spot, and find somebody that matches where you are now. Like I said, books are probably one of the easiest ways to skim and get a ton of information. So that's three. I broke the rule. I didn't give you just one, but there's three different ones that I find very, very helpful.
That's okay. That's a great answer. A lot of people cross industry is the best for when you want new ideas. So I like that. Cool. So that's all we have for the show today. Jeff, thank you so much for a great talk on how to make all of this content, how to distribute it. It kind of turned into a podcast on how to start your own show if you wanted to. And that's great too, because you got to start before you can distribute. So for anyone out there, good luck starting your show. Visit Jeff and his blog. Where can we hear more about you, your podcast? Where's the best place that people can reach you to ask questions about how to get started?
For me personally, I would say my personal site, which is just jefflarge.com. I get to interview all sorts of amazing people. I'm a little behind on my episodes right now, but that's great. And then I'm most active personally on Twitter, and you basically just Google Jeff Large and I'll show up because I've purposely claimed most of those domains and everything. So you should be able to find me.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. If anyone wants to learn more, reach out on Twitter, reach out on LinkedIn. You might be on his next show. Apparently, he needs people to interview.
No, I do not. don't say that. It's not true.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
Another
This is
Masters
awesome.
of Marketing. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much, Jeff. And we'll catch up
guys.
about how we've run into each other before.
All right, later.
Bye.